In this lesson, we're going to talk about independent variables and dependent variables. So we're going to start to talk about linear functions in the second half of this unit, or in the third half, or in the third part of this unit. And independent and dependent variables are going to become very important. And so in this lesson, all we're going to learn to do is we're going to learn what they are and learn how to identify them. Okay, so what is an independent variable? An independent variable is a variable that does not depend on another one. It's independent of itself. It's sort of on its own. Okay, think of it like as an adult. It's also a variable that has an operation being performed to it. And this one here is really, really key. It's sort of like a freebie, if you want to think about it that way. So it's the variable that has an operation being performed to it. So if you want, you can think about it this way. So the independent variable in this equation is b because it has an operation being performed to it. It has a +4 being performed to it. And the reason why it's independent is because whatever happens to b affects a. Okay, and so A is what we would call the dependent variable. It's the variable that depends on the other. So whatever B decides to do, if it decides to add 4 to itself, if it decides to subtract 2, if it decides to divide itself by 28, it impacts what happens to A. Okay, so the independent variable is sort of like the adult. It does what it wants to do, and the dependent variable is kind of like the child. It's the reaction to the independent variable. All right, so here are some words that I want you to think about as we're talking about independent and dependent. So the independent is the cause. It's what happens before, and it's also the input value. And this is going to be really important going forward in the next couple of lessons. It's what you do in the situation. Okay, the dependent variable is the effect. So when you talk about cause and effect, that's when you talk about independent and dependent. It's what happens after, and it's also the output. And I'm circling this input and output. You'll see why they come into play in later lessons. So the dependent variable is what happens. And so really, the dependent is the after, the results, okay, of the independent variable. All right, when we go to graph, which is what we're going to do a lot of over the next couple of days, the dependent variable is going to end up on the y-axis, and the independent variable is going to end up on the x-axis here, okay? And so this is going to be, you might want to make a note of this, the input, and then this here is going to be the output. All right, so now let's look at actual situations. So what are the independent and the dependent variables? And so remember I told you that the independent variable is the one that has the operation being performed to it. So in this case, which one has an operation being performed to it? Well, the n does right here because it has a 3 being multiplied to it. So the n is the independent, and so that leaves the p to be the dependent, because whatever the n decides to do will impact what happens to the p. Okay, next one. Which one is the independent? Well, which one has the operation being performed to it? The x. And so the y is the dependent. Okay, which one is the independent? The e, because it has the operation being performed to it, which means that the d is the dependent. Okay, now let me put this into actual words, into actual situations. So points scored and baskets attempted. So which one is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable? So which one of these, the way that I like to word it is which one of these is dependent on the other? Are the number of baskets dependent on the points scored, or the points that you score dependent on the baskets? Well, in this case, the points that you score are dependent on how many baskets you attempt. So the points are dependent on the baskets. Okay, the warmer the temperature, the more ice cream cones sold. So which one is dependent on the other? And again, I like to find the dependent first when it comes to this one because I find it easier, but if you want to find the independent first, again, that's fine too. So which one is dependent on the other? Is the temperature dependent on the ice cream cones sold, or are the ice cream cones dependent on the temperature? So in this case, the ice cream cones are dependent on the temperature, because you're not going to sell a lot of ice cream cones in the winter. So time spent studying and grades on your test. So are your grades dependent on your studying, or is your studying dependent on your grades? Well, your grades are dependent on your studying, because if you don't study, you don't get good grades. Okay, cell phone charges per minute for international calls. So are your charges dependent on the minutes that you use, or are your minutes dependent on your charges? Well, your charges are dependent on your minutes, because depending on how many minutes you use depends on your charges, okay? So the more minutes you use, the more that you're charged, for international calls anyway. It actually used to be way back when that you didn't have an unlimited number of minutes, but that's a whole other story. Okay, amount of time jogging and calories burned. So which one is dependent on the other? Are calories dependent on jogging, or is jogging dependent on calories? Well, in this case, your calories burned is dependent on the amount of time that you jog. And I'm getting the letters from here. And usually it'll assign you a variable. Okay, so you go ahead and try these 5 and we will compare answers. All right, go ahead and hit pause if you're not done. So for the first 3, these are just basic equations here. So for the first 3, remember that the independent variable is the one that has the operation being performed to it. So for the first one, the independent is the x, because it has the +3, and the dependent is the y. For the second one, the independent is j, because it has the -4 with it, and the dependent is p. And then for the third one, the independent is a, because it's squared and it's being multiplied by 4 and it has a -2, and the dependent is b. And then for the last 2 here, the temperature and the number of people at the beach. So the dependent is the number of people at the beach, because the temperature is the independent. So the number of people at the beach are dependent on how warm it is. The warmer it is, the more people at the beach. The colder it is, the less people at the beach. All right, the last one, hours worked and wages earned. So wages is dependent on hours, because the more hours you work, the more money you will earn. The less hours you work, the less money you will earn. All right, that's it. A nice, short, and sweet lesson. We'll do a practice sheet in class. Oh, no, we will not do a practice sheet in class. Actually, we're going to play a game to review in class for this one. But feel free to definitely ask me any questions that you have.